Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about a seemingly peaceful family portrait that holds the key to a century-old murder mystery. A story that you might have never heard before, a mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from that helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. Some objects are more than just relics of time. They are silent witnesses, vessels that hold the echoes of forgotten tragedies, waiting patiently in the dust for a curious hand, an eye sharp enough to decipher their whispers. Our story begins on a crisp October morning in Chicago, at an estate sale where the belongings of a long-dead family were being offered up to the highest bidder. It was here that one such witness was about to awaken the ghosts of the past. The Tudor-style mansion of the Williamson family stood as a monument to a bygone era, its grand oak doors now thrown open to the casual scrutiny of strangers. A low murmur of voices filled its cavernous halls, mingling with the scent of beeswax and decay. People drifted from room to room, their fingers letting a film of dust ghost over polished mahogany sideboards and tarnished silver tea sets. Every item, from a porcelain doll with a cracked face to a set of leather-bound books, was tagged and numbered, its history condensed into the cold calculus of a price tag. Among the collectors and bargain hunters was Sophia Martinez, an antique dealer whose profession was not merely to trade in objects, but to read them. For her, every scratch on a table, every faded patch on a rug, told a story. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her trained eyes scanning, assessing, and dismissing the clutter of a life that was not her own. And then, in the solemn, oak-paneled library, amongst a gallery of faded family pictures, something stopped her cold. It was housed in an ornate silver frame, heavy in the hand, its intricate floral carvings dulled by a century of oxidation. The photograph within depicted a young family, clearly captured in the prosperous bloom of the 1920s. They were the very embodiment of the American dream. The man, handsome and severe in a three-piece suit, possessed an air of unshakable confidence, his hair slicked back in the popular style of the day. The woman seated beside him, adorned in a fashionable drop-waist flapper dress and ropes of pearls, offered a gentle, serene smile to the camera. And between them, swaddled in an impossibly intricate white lace christening gown, was an infant. Everything in the composition spoke of calculated perfection, the professional studio lighting that cast soft shadows, the expensive, fashionable attire, the proud posture of a successful young family in their comfortable home. It was a perfect snapshot of the glorious, roaring jazz age. But perfection, as Sophia knew, was often a facade. As she drew the frame closer, a chilling dissonance pierced through the happy veneer. It wasn't the couple's confident smiles. It was the baby, the eyes of the infant, a soul no older than 6 months, held none of the vacant, milky innocence typical of his age. Instead, they possessed a stunning, unnerving intensity, an awareness that felt ancient and profound. It was not the wide-eyed wonder of a child discovering the world. It was something deeper, something akin to a primal, knowing fear. His tiny face was tense, his gaze locked not on the camera, nor on the loving parents who held him, but on a fixed point just beyond the photographer's lens. He seemed to be staring at an unseen presence in the room, a spectre of dread that only he could perceive. A cold shiver traced a path down Sophia's spine. Could a photograph do more than capture light and shadow? Could it capture the very soul of a tragedy in the making? Could the eyes of a child who could not yet speak tell a horrifying story? Buried for a century, the photograph, with the embossed stamp of a prestigious studio and a faded, elegant script on its back, was dated October 15th, 1920. It was born into a world that was intoxicating itself on a cocktail of glamour and denial. The Chicago of the 1920s was a symphony of contradictions. By day, it was a city of raw, gilded ambition. It was the muscular heart of America, with its roaring stockyards, its fiery steel mills, and its proud skyscrapers clawing at the clouds. Financial titans like Robert Williamson, the man in the portrait, built empires on the relentless optimism of a booming nation. By night, the city transformed into a glittering, hedonistic stage. The feverish pulse of jazz spilled from illicit speakeasies, where notorious figures like Al Capone built their own violent empires. In lakeside mansions, lavish parties stretched until dawn, fueled by bootleg champagne and a desperate, dazzling desire to forget the horrors of the Great War. But beneath that glittering, frenetic veneer lay a much darker reality. It was a world built on a rigid, unforgiving social hierarchy, where the power of money and a pristine reputation could purchase silence and conceal the most sinister of crimes. A gentleman's name, especially one associated with old money and financial power, was a shield of near total impunity. The police, often mired in corruption themselves, rarely dared to question what happened behind the closed doors of the city's elite. And in this world, medicine was still emerging from the shadows of guesswork. Doctors of the era, however well-intentioned, lacked the forensic tools and scientific understanding to decipher the complex mysteries of the human body. Sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS, was not yet a specific diagnosis, but a convenient catch-all label, a medical shroud for inexplicable tragedies. It was a way to close a file, to offer a semblance of an answer to grieving parents, and to avoid uncomfortable questions. It was the perfect cover for a death that might have had a far more malevolent cause. Perhaps the deepest shadow in this social landscape, however, was the enforced silence of women, legally and financially bound to their husbands. Their voices were systematically devalued, their anxieties, their fears. Their very intuitions were often dismissed with condescending medical jargon. A woman who questioned her husband's authority or voiced a desperate concern could find herself diagnosed with nervous exhaustion or hysteria, vague, insidious terms designed to invalidate her reality. This diagnosis was a social and medical weapon, turning a potential witness into a patient, a sane woman into a troubled hysteric. For a wife like Catherine Williamson, the serene woman in the portrait, this cultural prison was inescapable. It was a place where even the most horrifying truth could be smothered into the supposed ramblings of a fragile mind. It was in this society, rife with prejudice and fatal blind spots, that the Williamson family tragedy was allowed to take root and fester, perfectly hidden in plain sight. Nearly a century later, the photograph, perhaps the sole surviving relic of that tragedy, fell into the hands of Sophia Martinez. Sophia was more than an antique dealer in her own mind. She was a custodian of forgotten narratives. She believed that objects absorbed the emotions of their owners, that they carried a palpable weight of the lives they had touched. Every item she handled was a conversation. Most offered only faint whispers of everyday life. But the Williamson portrait, this one screamed. She felt it the moment she picked it up, a coldness radiating from the silver. a profound sadness that seemed to seep into her skin. She was not drawn by the frame's potential value or the historical importance of the famed photographer. She was drawn by that inexplicable feeling of disquiet, a magnetic connection to the infant's desperate gaze. It felt like a silent plea, a message in a bottle that had finally washed ashore after a 100-year voyage. In the bustling commercial atmosphere of the sale, where every human story was being auctioned off, Sophia felt as if he and the child in the picture existed in a silent, private space. Her decision to purchase the photograph for $25 was not a business transaction. It was an act of surrender. It was a surrender to a nascent obsession, a powerful urge to give a voice to the silent scream she felt emanating from the image. She did not know that by carrying that portrait out of the grand, lonely mansion, she wasn't just acquiring an antique. She was accepting the mantle of listener for a victim who had been silenced for far too long, and beginning a solemn journey into the heart of a darkness she could never have imagined. Back in the quiet, consecrated sanctuary of her Lincoln Park antique shop, surrounded by the silent ghosts of other people's lives, Sophia Martinez placed the Williamson portrait on a velvet-lined workbench. The world outside, with its insistent traffic and the distant, mournful cry of a siren, faded into a dull, irrelevant hum. Here, within these walls, where history was palpable, time itself seemed to bend. The past was not a foreign country, but an adjacent room, its door slightly ajar, waiting to be entered, with the delicate, practiced precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. She selected a thin palette knife from a toolkit. She slid its edge under the small metal tabs, holding the photograph in its century-old prison, gently prying each one back. The heavy silver frame was cold against her skin, its substantial weight a constant reminder of the family's immense wealth and the gravity of the story it held. As the thick cardboard backing came loose, a faint, dry scent of old paper, oxidized silver, and forgotten decades filled the air, the very breath of the past. She carefully lifted the photograph, its cardstock stiff and brittle with age, and held it by its edges as if it were a sacred relic. Turning it over was a moment of quiet reverence, a silent communion with the object. For it was the back of the photograph that held the first true whispers of its story, the first tangible threads of a narrative that had been dormant for 100 years. An embossed stamp, elegant and authoritative in its design, read Henryk Kowalski Photography Studio, Chicago, Illinois, Kowalski. Sophia's pulse quickened, a jolt of professional recognition. The name resonated with significance. He was no mere street photographer capturing fleeting moments. He was an artist, a celebrated chronicler of Chicago's Gilded Age elite, renowned for portraits that were said to capture not just a likeness, but the very essence of a person's soul. Below the stamp, written in a graceful, looping script that spoke of a confident hand, was the date October 15th, 1920. And beneath that, inscribed in a different, slightly more hurried hand, were 3 names: Robert, Catherine, and baby Thomas Williamson. Thomas! The name gave the terrified eyes a specific identity, a human anchor in the vast, indifferent sea of time. For the next 2 hours, the only sounds in the shop were the soft, rhythmic clicking of Sophia's keyboard and the low, meditative whir of her computer's fan. The cool blue glow of the screen cast an ethereal light on her face, illuminating her focused expression as she descended into the digital catacombs of historical archives. She cross-referenced the names, the date, the prestigious North Lakeshore Drive address that would have been associated with a family of their immense stature, public records, census data, and the society pages of archived newspapers began to paint a picture of the Williamsons, a carefully curated portrait of success, influence, and civic virtue. But it was a methodical search through the digital archives of the Chicago Tribune that stopped her heart. There, in the stark, black and white finality of a scanned newspaper page, was a small, unassuming entry tucked away in the obituaries section. It was dated mid-November 1920. The entry was brief, a mere footnote in the daily chronicle of a city teeming with life and death. It announced the tragic and untimely passing of Thomas Williamson, infant son of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Williamson of North Lakeshore Drive. The cause of death, it stated, was listed as sudden infant death syndrome. Sophia leaned back from the screen, her mind racing, performing a chillingly simple calculation. The photograph had been taken on October 15th. The obituary was from mid-November. The beautiful, prosperous family portrait was not a celebration of life. It was a photograph of the condemned, the child in his mother's arms, the child with the ancient, fearful eyes, would be dead within weeks of the shutter's click. The mystery of the infant's gaze was no longer a curious, artistic anomaly. It had transformed into a horrifying prophetic premonition. Sophia's initial obsession, born of an antique dealer's intuition, now hardened into a solemn, urgent mission. The child's eyes were not just telling a story, they were crying out for a witness. A single death, however tragic, could be an accident of fate, a cruel twist of biology. But as Sophia delved deeper, she began to suspect that fate had very little to do with the profound sorrow that seemed to cling to the Williamson name like a shroud. The initial shock of Thomas's death propelled her out of the digital world and into the hallowed, silent halls of the Chicago History Museum. Here, surrounded by the tangible, physical artifacts of the city's past, she sought out more concrete records, birth certificates, death certificates, property deeds. In the hushed, cathedral-like quiet of the research room, the only sound was the delicate, papery rustle of brittle, century-old pages as she carefully turned the leaves of the thick, heavy county ledgers. The air smelled of aging paper and bookbinding glue, the scent of documented history. And it was there, in a book of mortality records from 1918, that she found it. Another entry, another small, forgotten tragedy recorded in neat, bureaucratic ink. It was a death certificate for a Mary Williamson, age 8 months, parents Robert and Catherine Williamson. Cause of death, sudden infant death syndrome. Sophia leaned back in her chair, the air leaving her lungs in a slow, cold rush as the words blurred before her eyes. 2 babies, 2 deaths, 1 family, 1 tragically convenient, scientifically vague explanation. The statistical probability of such a thing happening twice in the same affluent family, even with the limited medical understanding of the era, felt astronomically, impossibly small. This was no longer just a tragedy. It was a pattern, a terrifying, repeating pattern of death that seemed to follow the Williamson children into their cribs with the certainty of a predator. With this grim discovery, the carefully constructed portrait of the father, Robert Williamson, began to violently fracture in her mind. Who was this man? This titan of finance who seemed to preside over a household of such profound and repeating sorrow. Sophia's research shifted its focus, peeling back the glossy layers of his public persona. Historical business journals and newspaper articles from the period between 1919 and 1920 revealed a man known for his towering ambition and his chilling ruthlessness. He had been a key player in several controversial investment schemes, high-risk ventures that skirted the very edges of legality and had left other, less fortunate families financially ruined, while never formally charged with any crime. His name was whispered in connection with fraud, betrayal, and a complete lack of moral scruples. He was a man who saw the world as a grand chessboard, a series of transactions, of assets and liabilities. A chilling, intrusive thought began to form in Sophia's mind. A question she could not push away. Did he view his own family, his own children, through the same cold, calculating lens? The contrast with his wife, Catherine, could not have been more stark or more heartbreaking. Sophia uncovered medical records from a private sanitarium documenting two separate, extended hospitalizations for Catherine during 1920. The diagnosis was the same in both instances: nervous exhaustion. The term was a clinical dismissal, a way for the male-dominated medical establishment of the time to pathologize female distress without truly investigating its source. But Sophia, a woman of a different century, saw something else entirely. She saw a woman drowning in an unspeakable grief, a mother who had now lost two children to the same mysterious ailment. Or was it something more sinister? Was this the portrait of a woman being systematically, deliberately driven to the edge of her sanity? Her legitimate fears and maternal intuitions being twisted and treated as symptoms of a fragile, hysterical female mind. The pressure of the past was escalating, the weight of these discoveries pressing down on the present. The happy family in the photograph was now a grotesque lie, its ornate silver frame containing a dark triptych of a ruthless predator, a tormented victim, and a child who had seen too much. The breakthrough, when it came, was not found in a public archive or a dusty ledger. It arrived unexpectedly, a whisper from the grave delivered by sheer chance. It came from a box of miscellaneous family papers that had been part of a larger, unremarkable lot Sophia had acquired from the Williamson estate. Tucked away at the very bottom, bundled with old receipts for groceries and tailoring, was a small tight stack of personal letters, tied with a faded, brittle silk ribbon. Most were mundane correspondences, thank you notes, holiday greetings, but one, written on delicate, almost translucent onion skin paper, felt different. The handwriting was erratic, a frantic, spidery scrawl that dug into the page, the loops and crosses of the letters betraying an extreme emotional distress that was palpable even after 100 years. It was a letter from Catherine Williamson to her sister, Margaret, and it was dated November 20th, 1920, a mere 5 days after the death of her infant son, Thomas. Sophia's hands trembled as she carefully unfolded the fragile, creased pages. What she read was not the lament of a grieving mother resigned to a cruel fate. It was a terrified, whispered accusation, a scream of truth that had been silenced and pathologized for 100 years. Dearest Margaret, the letter began, the ink slightly blurred as if by tears. I cannot bear to stay in this house another day. I see his ghost in every shadow. Thomas is gone, just like our sweet Mary, and I know in my heart, I know, that Robert, I cannot bring myself to write the words, but you know what I suspect. The doctor says it was the same condition, a weakness of the heart, but I have seen how Robert looks at the children when he thinks no one is watching. There is something cold in his eyes, Margaret, something empty, an appraisal. It frightens me. Sophia had to pause, placing the letter on the velvet cloth and taking a deep, steadying breath. The words felt alive, charged with a century of fear. The letter was a direct confession of Catherine's deepest, most unspeakable terrors, a desperate plea to an outside world to be believed. She picked it up and continued reading. I found the bottle of laudanum hidden in his study again. in the back of his desk drawer, far more than any person would need for occasional pain. And the night Thomas died, Robert had been alone with him for over an hour before he called for help. He said he was letting me rest when I rushed in and touched my baby's skin. It was so cold. Margaret, so unnaturally cold. He claims I'm losing my mind to grief, that I am becoming unwell again, just as before. But I'm not mad. I am terrified. The letter was a lightning bolt, a moment of horrifying, sickening clarity that burned away all speculation and doubt. The mystery was no longer about what had happened to the Williamson children. The mystery had shifted, twisting into something far more intimate and psychologically terrifying. It was now about Catherine. How does a woman survive, trapped in a gilded cage with a man she believes to be a monster? How does she navigate the suffocating daily rituals of a high society marriage, the shared meals, the polite conversations, the public pretense of a life together, while carrying the soul-crushing knowledge that the man sleeping beside her is the one who murdered her children? The photograph on Sophia's workbench was no longer just a clue. It was Catherine's silent, desperate corroboration, the proof that her baby had seen the same cold, calculating emptiness in his father's eyes that she had. The investigation had reached its midpoint climax. A secret, locked away in a mother's broken heart and a child's terrified eyes, had finally, violently, broken free. Catherine's letter was no longer just a clue. It was a map drawn from the depths of a mother's terror, leading not to a hidden treasure, but to the heart of an unthinkable crime. The words laudanum, his study, and the nursery burned in Sophia's mind. The suspicions, the patterns, the psychological horror, they now had a physical geography. The Williamson mansion on North Lakeshore Drive was not just a historical building. It was a crime scene, preserved in amber for a century. Armed with a copy of the letter and a growing sense of grim determination, Sophia knew she had to cross its threshold one more time. Her research into the property records had revealed something remarkable. The original house, though converted into luxury condominiums in the 1980s, was still standing, its foundational structure largely intact. The current owner of what had once been the Williamsons' primary residence was a Duchess of Tawut, Amanda Foster, a pediatrician who, as fate would have it, had purchased the condo specifically because of its rich and storied history. A phone call, filled with a careful explanation of her research, was met not with skepticism, but with an intrigued, professional curiosity. Dr. Foster agreed to meet. The following afternoon, Sophia found herself standing before the elegant limestone facades of the building once more, as she was led through the renovated space. It was easy to imagine how it had looked in 1920. The high ceilings, the large, gracious windows overlooking the steely gray expanse of Lake Michigan, and the ornate crown moldings all spoke of an era of unapologetic opulence. Dr. Foster, a woman with a kind face and intelligent eyes, gestured toward the main living area. This was the living room, she explained. The placement of the windows and the fireplace aligned perfectly with the portrait. Sophia pulled out the photograph, and a profound, unsettling chill washed over her as she held the image of the past against the reality of the present. The space was the same. It was here that Robert Williamson had sat, projecting an image of paternal pride, while his son, cradled in his mother's arms, had stared in silent terror at the monster he knew his father to be. But it was not this room that Sophia had come to see. With a deep breath, she showed Dr. Foster the contents of Catherine's letter. As the pediatrician read, her professional composure slowly gave way to a look of horrified understanding. Laudanum poisoning, Dr. Foster whispered, the clinical term sounding obscene in the beautiful. Sunlit room? The symptoms in an infant lethargy. Respiratory distress could have been easily, almost perfectly, mistaken for SIDS in that era. Dr. Foster then led Sophia down a hallway to a room that now served as her home office. According to the original floor plans, this was the nursery, she said, her voice now low and serious. When I renovated, I discovered something extraordinary. She pointed to a section of the wall where a large square of the original, delicate floral wallpaper had been carefully preserved under a sheet of museum-quality glass. The contractors wanted to tear it all down, but I insisted on saving a piece. Look closely. Sophia leaned in, her eyes tracing the faded pattern of roses and vines, and then she saw them. Interspersed within the floral design were small, dark, smudged stains. They were clustered at a height that would have been just above the railing of a crib. I've always wondered about those, Dr. Foster said, but there's more. She guided Sophia to another preserved section near the corner of the room. Here, the stains were different, larger, more irregular, as if a liquid had been spilled or wiped away in haste, out of sheer curiosity. Given the history of the children's deaths, Dr. Foster confessed, I had a small sample of these stains professionally analyzed a few years ago. They tested positive for trace amounts of opium alkaloids, the primary component of laudanum. The air in the room grew thick and cold. Here it was, the physical proof, the irrefutable, scientific evidence that corroborated a mother's century-old, terrified whispers. This room had not been a sanctuary. It had been a chamber of slow, methodical poisoning. But the house had not yet given up all of its secrets. Dr. Foster walked to her desk and retrieved a small, leather-bound book. I also found this, she said, her voice barely audible. It was wedged beneath a loose floorboard in the closet of this very room. It appears to be a partial diary, written by Catherine, with trembling hands. Sophia accepted the diary. The handwriting was the same frantic scrawl as the letter. The words, a testament to a mind on the brink of collapse. She turned to an entry dated October 10th, 1920, just 5 days before the portrait was taken. Thomas has been so listless lately, Catherine wrote, sleeping far more than a healthy baby should. When I mentioned this to Robert, he became angry, saying I was being an overprotective mother, just as I had been with Mary. But I watch him when he thinks I am not looking. I have seen him give Thomas what he claims is medicine from a small brown bottle. But the baby always becomes so drowsy afterward. I found the bottle in his study again, the same type that was there when Mary was sick. He says it is for his back pain, but I have never once seen him take any himself. There are tiny scratches on the bottle's label, as if someone has been carefully measuring doses. Tonight, I'm going to watch more carefully. I'm going to protect my son, even if it means... The entry ended there. Abruptly, the ink trailing off as if Catherine had been suddenly interrupted. The diary was the final, devastating piece of evidence. It was a real-time account of the murders, a mother's chronicle of her own dawning, helpless horror. The walls of the nursery seemed to close in around Sophia, filled with the silent screams of the innocent children who had perished within them. The discovery of the laudanum and the diary shifted the investigation into a new phase. Sophia now had the victim's account and the physical evidence, but to complete the picture, she needed an objective, contemporary witness, someone outside the family's toxic dynamic who had seen them in that specific terrible moment in time. She needed to find the ghost of Henryk Kowalski. Her research led her to the Chicago Photography Archives at Columbia College, where Kowalski's extensive studio records had been donated after his death in 1965. She arranged a meeting with the head archivist, a meticulous historian named Dr. Marcus Webb, who was immediately fascinated by her story. Kowalski was incredibly detailed in his record keeping. Dr. Webb explained as they descended into the climate-controlled basement where the archives were stored. The air was cool and dry, smelling of acid-free paper and preservation chemicals. He documented not just the technical aspects of each shoot, the lighting, the camera, the film stock, but he often included his personal observations about his subjects. He believed a portraitist had to be a psychologist. They located the ledger for the year 1920. It was a massive, leather-bound volume, its pages filled with Kowalski's precise, elegant handwriting. Dr. Webb carefully turned the brittle pages to the October entries, and there it was, an entry dated October 15th, 1920. It was Kowalski's unwitting testimony, a confession written by a man who had no idea he was documenting the prelude to a murder. Sophia read the entry over Dr. Webb's shoulder, her heart pounding with each perfectly penned word. Client, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Williamson, with infant son Thomas. Commission, formal family portrait for holiday cards. Payment, $50 in advance. Technical notes. Natural lighting from east windows, supplemented with silver reflector. Miss Williamson appeared very nervous throughout the session, frequently checking on the baby. Mr. Williamson was impatient, seemed to want to complete the session as quickly as possible. The final section was labeled Personal Observations. It was here that the full chilling truth was revealed. Personal observations. Unusual family dynamic. The baby, Thomas, appeared distressed whenever the father approached him. Mrs. W. was exceptionally protective and would not allow her husband to hold the child during any of the poses. The infant, while healthy in appearance, seemed unusually alert, almost wary. For his age, I recommended they reschedule for a time when the baby was more settled. But Mr. W. insisted on proceeding. During the final exposures, the baby became highly agitated when the father moved closer for the group pose. The expression captured in the final plates shows the infant's clear and unambiguous distress. Mrs. W. later requested that I not include certain poses in the final selection she was shown. Sophia felt a profound chill run down her spine. It was all there. Kowalski, the detached artist, had seen it all. He had seen Catherine's desperate, protective fear. He had seen Robert's cold impatience. And most importantly, he had seen and documented baby Thomas's terrified reaction to his own father. The photograph was not an accident. It was a deliberate capture of a moment of truth. But there was one more folder, containing correspondence related to the Williamson session. Inside was a letter from Catherine to Kowalski, dated November 25th, 1920, 10 days after Thomas's death. Dear Mr. Kowalski, it read, I'm writing to request all photographs and negatives from our October session. My husband has asked me to retrieve them due to our son's recent passing. However, I must ask you a personal favor. If you observed anything unusual during our session, anything that concerned you about my family's welfare, I implore you to document it and keep those records safe. I fear there may come a time when such observations become important. My baby's eyes in that final photograph. You captured something vital. Please, preserve it. This was Catherine's final, desperate act of resistance. She had known she couldn't save her son, but she had tried to preserve the truth of his fear, planting a seed of evidence in the hands of a stranger, hoping that one day someone would understand. Armed with a mountain of evidence that spanned a century, a haunted photograph, a mother's desperate letters and diaries, physical forensic proof, and the objective testimony of a long-dead witness, Sophia knew she had a moral obligation to see this through. She contacted Detective Maria Santos of the Chicago Police Department's Cold Case Unit. She expected to be dismissed, but Detective Santos, a seasoned investigator with a deep respect for history, was intrigued enough to meet with her at the antique shop. As Sophia laid out all the evidence on her workbench, creating a timeline of terror, Detective Santos listened with a growing, grim fascination. Obviously, we can't prosecute a case from 1920, Detective Santos said finally. Her voice filled with a mixture of professional regret and admiration for Sophia's work. But from an investigative standpoint, this is extraordinary. The pattern you've identified, the systematic elimination of dependents, the manipulation of a spouse, the use of a difficult-to-detect poison is consistent with what we now know about a certain type of serial killer, the family annihilator. These individuals, often motivated by financial gain or a narcissistic desire for control, kill their own family members. Infanticide cases from that era were rarely investigated thoroughly, especially when the perpetrator was a wealthy, respected member of the community, and laudanum poisoning. It would have been almost impossible to detect with 1920s medical knowledge. Robert Williamson had the perfect cover. Detective Santos pulled out her laptop and began searching modern, cross-referenced databases, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Let's see what became of our Mr. Williamson," she said, her tone hardening. After several minutes of searching, she found the records that would provide the final, horrifying chapter to the story. Robert Williamson had, after Catherine fled, remarried in 1925. His new bride was a wealthy widow named Helen Morrison. She had 2 young children from her previous marriage, a son and a daughter. Sophia's heart sank, sensing what was coming next. "No," she whispered. Detective Santos nodded grimly, her eyes fixed on the screen. Yes. Both of Helen's children died within 2 years of the marriage. The son, age 6. In 1926, attributed to a sudden, aggressive pneumonia. The daughter, age 4. In 1927, from what was vaguely described as a wasting sickness. Helen Morrison Williamson herself died in 1928, apparently from overwhelming grief and declining health. "He did it again," Sophia said, the words catching in her throat. "It certainly appears that way," Detective Santos confirmed, her voice cold with fury. By 1930, Robert Williamson had inherited the substantial fortunes of 2 families. He moved to California, where he lived a long and comfortable life, passing away in his sleep in 1954. He never remarried. He had no more children. The detective closed her laptop, the soft click echoing the finality of a closed casket. She looked at the photograph of baby Thomas, his eyes staring out from the past. "What you've uncovered here is the career of a prolific serial killer who used his social position and the medical limitations of his era to murder at least 4 children and likely 2 wives for financial gain. This child," she said, pointing to Thomas, "knew. He knew he was in danger. And that camera captured his recognition of a threat that the adults around him either couldn't see or chose to ignore." The confirmation of Robert Williamson's extended reign of terror sent shockwaves that rippled out from the quiet confines of Sophia's small antique shop, transforming a private obsession into a public historical reckoning. The Williamson name, once etched into the cornerstones of Chicago's banks and whispered with reverence in its most exclusive social clubs, began to collapse under the weight of its own monstrous history. The story, first spread through academic and historical circles, became a chilling local legend, a cautionary tale of high society horror. The photograph of baby Thomas, once an innocuous flea market find, was now being hailed as one of the most significant and certainly most haunting. pieces of forensic evidence from the early 20th century. The portrait of a family was irrevocably redefined as the portrait of a predator and his victims. 6 months after Sophia's initial discovery, the intellectual and historical communities demanded a forum to process the implications of the case. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the photography historian from Northwestern University who had first examined the image, organized a landmark symposium. Its title was simple yet profound: Photography as Historical Evidence. The Case of the 1920 Williamson Portrait. Scholars from across the country, criminologists, historians, sociologists, and photography experts gathered in a grand wood-paneled lecture hall. Behind the podium, a massive, high-resolution image of the Williamson portrait was projected onto a screen, dominating the room. Baby Thomas's fearful eyes, now larger than life, seemed to watch over the proceedings, a silent, judging gaze, finally receiving the attention and understanding he had been denied in life. Sophia stood before this esteemed audience, no longer just an antique dealer, but the reluctant historian who had given a voice to the dead. She recounted her journey, from the initial, unsettling feeling at the estate sale to the final, horrifying confirmation of a serial killer's career. This photograph teaches us that truth has a way of preserving itself, she concluded, her voice steady and clear, echoing through the silent hall, even when powerful people try to bury it beneath layers of wealth, reputation, and lies. Baby Thomas Williamson couldn't speak, he couldn't testify, and he couldn't protect himself. But his eyes told a story that survived for over a century, waiting patiently for someone to finally recognize what they were seeing. In the audience, a woman with silver hair discreetly wiped away a tear. After the presentation, she approached Sophia, her expression a mixture of profound sadness and deep gratitude. She introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Williamson, a retired psychiatrist from Portland, Oregon. She was Catherine Williamson's great-great-niece, the descendant of the very sister, Margaret, to whom Catherine had written that desperate, bleeding letter all those years ago. "I've been researching our family's history for years," Dr. Williamson explained, her voice soft but firm. "I always felt a great sorrow surrounding the story of my great-aunt Catherine, but the details were lost, shrouded in family whispers of her nervous condition. Your research has finally provided the answers I've been looking for." The following week, Dr. Williamson flew back to Chicago, bringing with her a small, leather-bound trunk of family documents that had been passed down through her line of the family items that Catherine had sent to her sister Margaret for safekeeping over the years. The most significant of these was Catherine's complete diary, which she had apparently mailed to Margaret in discreet, piecemeal sections between 1920 and 1925. The complete diary told the full harrowing story of a woman who had slowly, agonizingly realized that her husband was a monster, but who had been utterly trapped by the social and legal constraints of her era. The entry for October 15th, 1920, the day of the portrait session, was particularly revealing. "Today we had our photograph taken," Catherine wrote. "I insisted that Thomas be included, though Robert was reluctant. He said the baby would spoil the formal nature of the portrait. But I wanted a record of our family while Thomas is still with us. I have such fears about his health lately." During the session, I watched Robert's face when he looked at Thomas. It was the same expression I remember from when Mary was sick, a kind of cold calculation, as if he was studying a problem to be solved rather than looking at his own child. The photographer, Mr. Kowalski, was very kind. He seemed to notice that Thomas became upset whenever Robert came near. "I pray that Thomas will grow stronger, but I fear that Robert sees our children as obstacles to something he wants more." The diary continued through the weeks following Thomas's death, documenting Catherine's growing certainty that Robert had murdered their son. and her frantic, desperate plan to escape. She had faked a complete mental collapse to be placed under a doctor's care, using it as a pretense to leave the house and flee to her sister, taking nothing with her but the money she could secretly access. It was the only way to be free of him before. As she wrote in one terrifying entry, he decided that she, too, had become an obstacle. Dr. Williamson explained that Catherine had lived a quiet, solitary life until 1965. She never remarried and never had more children. Instead, she dedicated her life and a small inheritance to working with charities that helped abused women and children. A silent, lifelong penance and a tribute to the children she could not save. She had kept that one photograph of Thomas with her until the day she died. Then, Dr. Williamson handed Sophia one final, sealed envelope. Catherine's last letter, she said quietly. She left instructions that it only be opened if the full truth about her children was ever discovered. With trembling hands, Sophia opened the envelope. The paper was fragile, the handwriting shaky with age, but the words were filled with the strength that had endured for 45 years. To whoever finds this truth, the letter read, "My babies were murdered by their father, Robert Williamson, and I was powerless to save them. I have carried this secret and this guilt for nearly half a century, hoping that someday justice would find a way. If you are reading this, then it means Thomas's eyes finally spoke their truth. Please, remember his name. Remember that he was loved, that he was innocent, and that his brief, precious life mattered. Please remember that evil sometimes wears the most respectable face, but that truth has a way of surviving even the most powerful lies. Thank you for seeing what I saw in that photograph. Thank you for listening to my baby's silent testimony." As the symposium ended and the attendees began to disperse, Sophia remained seated, looking up at the enlarged portrait on the screen. Baby Thomas's eyes, no longer mysterious or merely haunting, had finally told their complete and terrible story. The photograph that had once depicted a happy, prosperous family now stood as a permanent, unshakable testament to the power of truth and the vital importance of believing those who cannot speak for themselves. The original portrait found its permanent home in the Chicago History Museum, displayed behind protective glass. It is the centerpiece of an exhibit dedicated to the Williamson family tragedy. The display includes Catherine's diary, Kowalski's ledger, and the story of Sophia's investigation. Visitors now often stand before it in silence, remarking on the baby's unusual, sorrowful expression. And now, finally, they can understand what those young, innocent eyes had been trying to say all along. They were not just seeing a father, they were seeing a monster, and in their silent, captured gaze, they left behind a warning that echoes through the century that the most terrifying darkness is often the kind that hides in plain sight. Smiling for the camera,